everybody, Sarah with Snugglebug Stitching. Today I'm going to show you how to chain piece some 9-patch blocks. So right here I've got a couple of layer cake squares that I stacked, squared off. I've got them right sides together, stacked them, squared them off, cut them into 9 3.25-inch squares, and since I cut them at the same time, they should be perfectly stacked and ready to chain piece. This is for a new pattern that I'm going to post onto the blog. It's going to be free. It's called Cakes, and it's a checkerboard style quilt, alternated between high volume and low volume, and it also keeps that distinct 9-patch style. So this right here is 2 layer cakes that I cut. I do have another video where I showed how I cut these, so that'll be in the link in the description if you want to check it out. And there'll also be a link to the blog post where the free pattern is going to be posted. So it's going to make 2 blocks that opposite match. You can see these right here. So these have the same fabrics, but one of them, this one has 5 high volumes and this one has 5 low volumes. So that's what we're going to do right now, is chain piece those. If you've never chain pieced before, no worries. I'm going to show you how to do it right now. So one thing you want to keep in mind when you chain piece or any kind of piecing is if you have a directional pattern, like this high volume here is stripes, you just want to make sure that they're all going in the same direction. So when you're chain piecing, you're feeding everything through the machine one after another without breaking the connection in between. So I'm going to show you how to do that right now. I've got my 1/4-inch seam foot on here. We're going to sew with a 1/4-inch seam, and these were cut right sides together, so they're already like that. And they should be perfectly stacked, so all you have to do is grab them. So we're going to start piecing these. I'm going to start grabbing that top square there, and I'm just going to put it in under the machine, and we'll just run it through the machine. Once that goes through, we'll grab the next one. And to make our checkerboard style, we're going to alternate. So right here I've got low volume up. The next one I run through, I'm just going to flip it over. Whoops. Flip it over. And we'll go high volume up. All right. Low volume up. All right, and since I already pulled these apart, I'm going to kind of put it to the side and we'll use it last. So, high volume up. So we just alternated between high volume up and low volume up, and we had 3 columns of 3-inch squares, or 3.25-inch squares. So once we get down to the last column, we're going to peel these apart, and you'll see why in just a minute. All right, so I'm going to cut that, pull this down. We're going to start opening up these 2 little seams here. And we're going to still keep with that alternating between high volume, low volume. So we've got high volume, low volume. The next one will be high volume. We're going to stack this up here. And like I said, we have a directional print here, so we're just making sure that that directional print is going the same direction every time. So once you get that nice and even, just run it through your machine. Still alternating high volume, low volume, so we just put a high volume through. The next one should be low. And we're going to keep this to where these diagonals are going the same direction. So they're going the same direction. Flip it pretty sides together. And we'll just keep doing that until we get all of those squares pieced in. that's got all of our rows assembled for the 2 blocks. Now, since these are going to be 2 separate blocks, we're going to cut this little connection between the 3rd and 4th row. And the reason for that is because I tend to get a little carried away when I chain piece, and that'll keep you from accidentally piecing all of them together and having one big rectangle instead of 2 separate blocks. Okay, so we are going to finger press these seams, and you can use your iron, but finger pressing does just as good for what we're doing. We're going to finger press these seams so that they'll nest up nicely. And if you don't know what nested seams are, no worries, we're about to talk about that too. So, for this checkerboard style, it works great to finger press your seams towards the dark side. So we're going to have our seams pressed so that on the back, the seam will be going in the direction of the high volume fabric. So I'll do that with both of these little squares. So you see here, I've got the seams going towards where the high volume fabric is. We're just going to press that. Same thing with this one. Seam is going in that direction. In the middle, it'll go towards the inside because it's going towards the high volume fabric. And we'll just keep doing that with both of these, pressing our seams towards the high volume fabric until we get them all finger pressed. And there's that one. And do the same thing with the next one. All right, so now that all those are pressed, we'll turn that over and show you. You can see that the seam is going towards the insides here, towards that high volume fabric. And on here, it's going towards the outside, towards that high volume fabric. And that is going to help our seams nest. So what nested seams means is when we go, we're just going to leave these connected like this, but when we go to sew these rows together, you can see that the fabric is so that when you put the seams, when you put the rows pretty sides together, you have one seam go in one direction and the other seam go in the other direction. And then you can kind of do your hands like this, and you can feel where those 2 ridges that it's made, you can feel where it comes together. So we're going to use our hands to hold that together, line these 2 sides right here up. We're going to put it through the machine like that. So using my hands here to hold that seam down, and we're going to run that through the machine. Once we get a little bit past where that seam is, we'll use our hands to feel the next seam lining up. This is going to make it where you have nice corners. Okay, so go a little bit past that seam and then use your hands to make sure that these 2 sides right here are lining up nicely. Okay, once that goes through, we're going to go ahead and chain piece this next block right behind it. So, turn your rows pretty sides together. Use your hands to feel where those 2 ridges line up. Make sure it's lined up here. And then that goes in the machine right behind that row 1 of the first block. Once you go a little bit past that seam, you'll do the same thing on your next one. You're just using your hands here to feel where those seams will line up. You can kind of feel where those 2 ridges go together. So use your hands to hold that down. Once you get a little bit past the seam, you can just make sure that these 2 sides line up and then finish that. Once that's done, we're going to flip this around and we're going to open these up right here. And then we'll flip these over and piece that last row, connect that last row to the block. So same thing, start off by using your hands, like I'm doing, to feel where those 2 ridges meet up. Line up the sides. Use your fingers to kind of hold that seam together. and run it through your machine. Once you sew a little ways past that seam, use your hands to feel where the next one lines up and hold it down. And once you get a little past that seam, make sure those edges line up all the way down. And then we'll open this side up and we're going to chain piece that other side, the last row of that second block, in right behind it. So start off by using your hands to make sure that those seams nest up nicely. You can kind of feel in between your thumbs. I'm kind of feeling in between my thumbs. That'll put those ridges together, and you can feel when they meet up. Use your hands to hold it still. Run that through the machine. Once you get a little ways past that seam, go ahead and line up your next seam. Once you've passed the seam, just go ahead and make sure that it lines up, the two sides line up all the way down. Finish that off. So we got two separate blocks here. The opposite match, 5 high volume, 5 low volume. Cut those apart and I'll show you which direction to press this long seam that we just made. So let's flip this over. You see this long seam right here? Which direction to press it. So if you press it, no matter where you press it, you're going to have one seam, one part of it that's not going to the dark side. So if I press it this direction, it's headed towards the dark side right here, but not on this one. So which way do you go? So what you're going to look at is you're going to base it on the corners. So these corners are high volume, so we'll want to press that seam towards those high volume. These corners are high volume. Press it towards the high volume. So let's flip it back over and we'll do that. We'll press it towards, press that seam towards that high volume corners. Same thing over here. Press that long seam towards the high volume corners. We're going to do the same thing on this side. So turn it over. Here's our long seam right here, that long seam we just made when we joined the rows. And these corners are low volume, so we want to press the seam towards the inside because you want it to go away from the low volume fabric. So we're pressing towards the dark side. Same thing here, seam goes inside. So let's do that. I'm going to press that seam away from the low volume. Same thing here. Press it away from the low volume. All right. So when I have these flipped back over, you can see that this long seam is going in away from these two low volume corners. This long seam is going in away from the low volume corners. This one is going out towards the high volume corners. This one's going out towards the high volume corners. What that's going to do for you is when you go to join all of your blocks, say I was joining it like this, these center seams should nest pretty nicely for you there. So you can kind of see I've got seams going in the opposite directions. And no matter how I turn this, that'll keep those center seams nesting nicely for me. All right, so that's those chain pieced. I did 2 at a time. You can do more than that. I would do as many at a time as your cutting area will allow. So if you have any questions, feel free to leave me a comment. If this helped you, hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. In the comment or in the description, there's going to be a link to the blog post that has this free pattern, and also a link to the first video I made where I cut the 9 patch squares. Thank you.